I was essentially portraying a character, a consistent persona, crafted specifically for the broadcast rather than just being myself. It anchored the narrative, establishing me as the executive figure, the chief in charge, giving the audience a reliable archetype to follow. At the onset, Willie Robertson truly believed that Duck Dynasty was a divine gift, an intervention intended to unify the clan and fortify their spiritual bonds. He saw it as the vehicle that transformed their quiet rural existence into a global spectacle. However long after the production crews packed up, he is finally unveiling a burden significantly more crushing than the public ever suspected. The series did not conclude due to a lack of interest or dwindling stardom. It ceased because the colossal triumph that elevated them was simultaneously dismantling their bonds piece by piece. So what was the definitive catalyst that compelled the Robertson family to abandon their empire? Stick around as we dig deep into the details to uncover the real story. You will want to hear every word of this. For years, Willie Robertson skillfully evaded the single inquiry that dogged his every step, dancing around the raw reality of the situation. What was the genuine reason behind the cancellation of Duck Dynasty? For ages, he provided nothing but courteous diplomatic evasions and partial explanations. He cited creative pivots, evolving family goals, or the organic conclusion of a veteran series. Yet in the year 2025, following the passing of the patriarch Phil Robertson and a succession of devastating personal tragedies that rattled the family's very foundation, Willie decided it was time to lay the cards on the table. The reality was infinitely more gut-wrenching than the rumours suggested. As Willie tells it, the vast Robertson dynasty did not crumble due to plummeting viewership numbers or a drought of narrative ideas. It fell apart because the family unit was fracturing from the inside out. Buckling under the relentless pressure of celebrity status, public controversies, and the unblinking eye of the media. At the height of their mania, they were captivating over 11 million spectators and generating multi-million-dollar revenues through an endless stream of branded products and merchandise. Nevertheless, behind the velvet curtain, the fissures were expanding fault lines that everyone desperately tried to ignore. The production had metamorphosed their previously uncomplicated existence into a chaotic war zone filled with heavy expectations, contractual duties, and severe psychological stress. They faced intense disputes over their brand identity, private quarrels, and a fatigue so profound that the family's solidarity, historically their most formidable asset, was rapidly eroding. Willie confessed that the scandals surrounding Phil Robertson marked a definitive point of no return. His father's candid and polarising comments to GQ magazine back in 2013 ignited a nationwide frenzy, sparking fury and a media inferno that the family was woefully ill-equipped to handle or contain. Although the network brought Phil back into the fold a mere 8 days later, the scars remained permanent. Corporate sponsors became skittish, production teams grew wary, and the family found themselves in a perpetual battle over the portrayal of their religious convictions on screen. Years down the line, Phil's physical condition started to deteriorate, and upon receiving an Alzheimer's diagnosis, the emotional bedrock of the entire series began to crumble even further. His passing in May of 2025 marked the end of an era that none of them were truly prepared to mourn. However, for Willie, there was a singular crystallising instant that brought the truth into sharp focus. In June of 2025, a seemingly trivial encounter with a street vendor served as a profound symbol revealing the staggering extent of the family's transformation. The Robertson name had formerly been synonymous with modesty, industriousness, and an unwavering commitment to their moral code. Yet in that fleeting interaction, Willie recognised that stardom had warped them into strangers. The genuine hospitality that once defined their public image was now eclipsed by irritability, a sense of privilege, and the crushing stress of existing under constant observation. That was the instant he understood the dynasty had become too large for its own spirit. When Willie eventually broke his silence, he refused to point fingers at the television network, the press, or the viewers. Instead, he placed the blame squarely on the insidious effects of fame, which had slowly siphoned their energy-drove wedges between siblings and stretched their bonds far beyond the breaking point. The saga of Duck Dynasty did not conclude because the American public lost interest. It concluded because the family could simply no longer remain true to themselves, as long as the lenses were focused on them. But if the demise of the show wasn't just a television event, where did the real disintegration occur? Pay close attention, because Willie is about to voice what was never captured on film. For countless years, Willie Robertson was perceived as the unflappable anchor of the franchise, the smiling diplomat, and the savvy entrepreneur who balanced light-hearted humour with high-stakes business. While the broadcast showed him navigating this effortlessly, the reality behind the curtain was that the burden of this persona was absolutely suffocating. The audience remained oblivious to the frequency with which Willie found himself isolated, acting as a lightning rod for pressure from all sides, silently calculating which crises could be extinguished and which ones threatened to incinerate the entire family legacy. As the figurehead of the brand, Willie occupied a precarious position caught between the corporate demands of the network and the needs of his kin. The executives at A&E demanded reliability, high viewership numbers, and material that would remain palatable to a broad national demographic. Conversely, the public clamoured for genuineness, yet recoiled with hostility whenever that honesty challenged their comfort zones. Meanwhile, the family itself yearned for Allegiant security and the liberty to exist without filters. Every monumental decision eventually landed in Willie's lap, and rarely did any resolution appease all parties involved. His role extended far beyond inking contracts or signing off on narrative arcs. He was engaged in perpetual risk assessment. A single clumsily edited sequence had the potential to ignite public fury. One misinterpreted remark could jeopardise lucrative sponsorships, vital partnerships, or even the physical safety of his household. Whenever a scandal erupted, Willie transformed into the family's human shield. He fielded the angry phone calls, drafted the press releases, repaired fractured relationships, and desperately attempted to prevent the tempest from battering the people he cherished most. Tragically, that heavy responsibility did not vanish when the director yelled "cut." The cameras stopped rolling, but the weight of the day didn't just vanish at the front door. It shadowed him right into his living room. What truly amplified the stress was the sheer magnitude of the hats he was forced to wear simultaneously. You have to remember, Willie wasn't simply serving as an executive producer behind the scenes. He was the chief executive officer of Duck Commander, tasked with steering a massive ship that had violently expanded from a humble backwoods family operation into a global multi-million-dollar merchandising empire. He was a devoted husband, constantly on the defensive, trying desperately to shield his wife from the stinging vitriol and relentless judgment of the public eye. He was a concerned father, witnessing his children navigate their most awkward years under a microscope they never signed up for. Simultaneously, he was a dutiful son, stuck in the impossible position of honouring the legacy of his parents, all while manoeuvring through a cutthroat media environment that thrives on sound bites and has zero tolerance for complexity or context. As the seasons wore on, Willie started to detect a palpable change in the atmosphere surrounding the production. That golden ticket, the chance to broadcast their unique brand of family ethics and country humour to the world, slowly morphed into a suffocating obligation that refused to let them breathe. The production call sheets began to dictate when they could have dinner together. The expectations of millions of strangers began to dictate how they handled their most private family matters. Even the interactions that were supposed to be authentic and heartfelt began to feel staged and hollow, simply because there was always a lens pointing in their direction. The unbridled enthusiasm that had launched the series gradually eroded, replaced by a constant state of guarded vigilance. Willie would later confess that acknowledging this loss of passion was the bitterest pill to swallow. There was no denying that the show had been a monumental blessing. It delivered unimaginable financial freedom, a massive megaphone for their message, and a cemented legacy that most families can only dream of. However, even the greatest miracles can transform into heavy crosses to bear when the emotional toll starts to outweigh the rewards. By the time the final seasons rolled around, Willie wasn't getting a charge out of the creative process anymore. Instead, he felt a grim responsibility to simply endure it and keep the ship afloat. This wasn't a sudden explosive crisis. It was a creeping, silent pressure that accumulated over time, manifesting in insomnia-riddled nights and strained, hushed debates behind closed doors. And the sinking feeling that the mental and emotional health of his loved ones was being weighed on a scale against Nielsen ratings and the fickle approval of the masses. Willie possessed the foresight to see that if the cameras kept rolling indefinitely, something fundamental was going to shatter, whether it was deep-rooted family bonds, their personal peace, or the simple freedom to exist without dreading the next morning's tabloid splash. The game was no longer about chasing stardom. It wasn't about hitting benchmarks for the television executives or impressing the fan base anymore. It had become a desperate fight for survival on every level, emotional, spiritual, and within the family unit itself. Once Willie arrived at that stark realization, pulling the plug on the franchise didn't feel like a defeat. It began to look like the only viable path to salvation. Yet to fully grasp why leaving the spotlight felt like a rescue mission, we need to rewind the tape and revisit the humble origins of this saga. Stick around because we are going back to the start to examine the meteoric rise that absolutely no one saw coming. Decades before the beards and bandanas became global icons, the Robertson clan was living a reality that couldn't have been further from the glitz of Hollywood. It was an existence defined by severe financial hardship, chaos, and a gritty will to just get by. Willie Jess Robertson entered this world on April 27th, 1972, in a tiny rural medical centre in Bernice, Louisiana, arriving just 48 hours before his father, Phil, celebrated turning 26. Back in those days, the family assets amounted to dirt, an uncanny ability to track waterfowl, and a vague prayer that tomorrow might be better than today. The 1970s were notoriously brutal times in the backwoods of northern Louisiana, offering little mercy to those without means. Cash was hard to come by, steady employment was a myth, and Phil Robertson was a man adrift, desperately looking for a compass. His severe struggle with the bottle cast a long, dark shadow over the household, ensuring that the days were volatile and the nights were fraught with anxiety. However, even in the middle of that chaos, the roots of their legendary toughness were quietly digging in. The pivotal shift occurred in the year 1980. Phil, whose demons had brought him to the precipice of losing his wife and alienating his sons forever, finally hit absolute rock bottom. It was at that nadir that he turned his life over to Christ, undergoing what the family law recounts as a radical and instant metamorphosis. Virtually overnight, the unpredictable figure who had introduced terror and uncertainty into their domestic life vanished. In his place stood a man rigorously dedicated to scripture, hard discipline, and the monumental task of reconstructing his family's foundation. Willie, who was just a wide-eyed kid at the time, had a front row seat to this overhaul. It profoundly moulded his worldview, forged his relentless drive, and gave him a concrete example of what true redemption looks like in the flesh. The house that once felt like a house of cards, transformed into a fortress built on order, affection, and spiritual devotion. Yet despite the emotional stabilisation, existence remained a grind. The Robertsons were scraping by, constantly making a dollar stretch until it snapped. Dinner often hinged entirely on whatever game Phil managed to drag out of the swamps that day. With zero room for luxury, the boys were taught from the jump that if you didn't work, you didn't eat. They were drafted into the family's survival strategy immediately. For Willie, that translated to endless shifts in the suffocating humidity of the Louisiana summer. Manually sanding wood, fitting components, taping up shipments, and manning the telephone lines as the enterprise slowly started to coalesce. Years before he ever held a corporate title or sat in a leather chair, he was already shouldering heavy responsibilities. But what truly distinguished Willie from his neighbourhood peers wasn't just his capacity for labour. It was his innate shark-like instinct for commerce. Even as an adolescent, he grasped complex concepts of consumer psychology, profit margins, and the critical importance of networking. While his buddies were making pennies, cutting grass or washing cars, Willie was spending his Saturdays pitching specialised gear directly to seasoned hunters, maintaining meticulous ledgers of his sales and deploying guerrilla marketing tactics that actually worked. This raw natural aptitude enabled him to occasionally bring home more cash than his own father. Not because the company was a juggernaut yet, but because Willie was relentless in finding ways to ensure the venture didn't just survive, but actually flourished against the odds. Those formative years provided the rugged bedrock for the savvy business mogul he was destined to become. University life broadened Willie's perspective significantly. It was during his initial stint at a private university that he crossed paths with a captivating young woman who was destined to completely rewrite his future. Her name was Corey Howard. She was sharp-grounded and possessed a keen business acumen that matched his own. Corey recognised a spark of potential in Willie that was invisible to almost everyone else at the time. They spent hours deep in conversation, not just about romance, but plotting out dreams, personal growth, and the ambitious strategy to catapult the family business out of the swamps and onto a global stage. This wasn't just a love affair. It was a meeting of minds built on shared vision rather than fleeting emotion. After transferring to a state university to focus intensely on business studies, Willie honed the commercial instincts and technical skills required to expand the family empire. On January 11th, 1992, barely 19 years of age, Willie and Corey tied the knot. To the outside world, they seemed recklessly young, naive, and overly ambitious. However, behind closed doors, they were forging a formidable alliance. Corey took command of the books, branding and logistics, acting as the operational anchor, while Willie drove the high-level strategy, hammered out sales deals and pushed for aggressive expansion. What started as a gritty local backwoods workshop eventually morphed into a household name destined to captivate not just hunters, but major retail chains and eventually a massive television audience of millions. The meteoric ascent of the brand was no stroke of luck. It was the calculated outcome of a childhood defined by hardship, a family unit, reconstructed through unwavering faith, and a young power couple convinced that their destiny far exceeded their current reality. Their triumph was statistically unlikely, which is exactly what made it so compelling. However, having belief is one thing, building a dynasty is another. So what actually occurred when Willie finally stepped into the driver's seat? Don't go anywhere. We are about to dissect the construction of a reality TV juggernaut. When Willie officially took charge of the company in 2002, the organisation was still functioning more like a hobbyist's garage project than a serious national contender. Orders were scribbled on napkins and loose scraps inventory was shoved into random closets, and total annual revenue was a meagre $8,000. Yet Willie looked past the mess and saw an opportunity that extended far beyond the Louisiana swamps. Armed with a business degree, an innate flair for marketing and a work ethic forged in the mud of the Delta, he embarked on a mission to completely transform the family legacy into a commercial powerhouse. His first order of business was to professionalise the chaos. Willie implemented rigorous inventory tracking systems, standardised the packaging and shipping protocols, and hustled relentlessly to lock down national distribution deals. Before long, their products began appearing on the shelves of massive sporting goods retailers from coast to coast. In a shockingly short period, the revenue figures exploded, climbing rapidly into the millions. While the patriarch may have engineered the original duck call, it was Willie who transformed that wooden whistle into a gold mine. However, the transition from a successful retail brand to a pop culture phenomenon was a winding road fraught with obstacles and skepticism. Between 2006 and 2008, Willie pitched the concept of a reality show centred on his eccentric family to numerous television executives. They all passed. The suits in the boardroom simply couldn't conceive that a group of bearded religious Southerners would resonate with a broad mainstream demographic. But Willie was tenacious. He figured if the big networks didn't get it, perhaps a niche hunting channel would. And he was right. From 2009 to 2011, the family produced their own series for a smaller outdoor lifestyle network. Those initial episodes were raw and unpolished, lacking high production values. They documented actual hunts, the family's sharp wit, and the often disorderly pulse of a rapidly expanding business. The audience loved the authenticity, helping the family sharpen the comedic timing and dynamic that would eventually fuel their global explosion. It was during this era that Corey made a strategic play that fundamentally shifted their financial future. While negotiating sponsorship deals for the series, she drew a line in the sand, insisting the family receive proper talent fees. Willie, who was only taking home a modest $28,000 a year back then, thought her demand of $30,000 per season per cast member was bordering on delusional. To his shock, the executives didn't even blink. They agreed. Immediately, that was the light bulb moment. The family realised they were no longer just manufacturing duck calls. They were becoming legitimate entertainment personalities. The true tipping point arrived when a producer based in Los Angeles stumbled upon their niche cable episodes and saw the raw ingredients of a massive hit. He took the concept to a major cable network where executives were intrigued but hesitant. Initially, the network brass assumed they were buying just another gritty blue-collar documentary series about swamp life. However, when they reviewed the pilot footage, their perspective shifted entirely. The grit was there, but so was a surprising amount of heart and comedy, anchored by relatability and Willie's role as the straight man managing the absolute chaos. The network gave the green light, and the show premiered on March 21st, 2012. The public reaction was nothing short of a cultural tidal wave. The unique cocktail of unapologetic faith-sharp humour and southern hospitality struck a chord with the American public. By the time season 4 rolled around, the premiere attracted a staggering 11.8 million viewers, cementing its place as the most watched non-fiction cable broadcast in United States history. What began as a humble backyard operation had mutated into a colossal multimedia empire fueled by Willie's strategic foresight, Corey's financial genius, and a family whose real life was. The reality of their situation was far more compelling and dramatic than any scripted drama Hollywood could ever dream up. But when stardom strikes with that kind of lightning speed, you have to ask, what was the hidden price tag attached to it? Don't go anywhere, because we are peeling back the curtain. Behind the scenes, this was a family unit under immense fracturing strain. As the Duck Dynasty phenomenon swept across the nation, turning into a cultural juggernaut, life inside the Robertson compound became infinitely more complex and chaotic than the casual viewer could ever imagine. From the crack of dawn until late into the night, A&E production crews invaded their personal sanctuary, documenting every single interaction, every heated argument, and every fleeting attempt at cracking a joke. What the audience perceived as effortless southern charm and easygoing banter actually required grueling hours of setup, endless retakes, and precise coordination that drained the life out of the room. Standing right in the eye of this hurricane was Willie Robertson, the CEO of Duck Commander, the face of the family brand, and the linchpin of the show's entire narrative arc. Trying to balance these massive responsibilities meant he was constantly juggling the cutthroat demands of a booming business while performing the emotional labour required to keep his family sane and the television machine oiling along. However, the patriarch Phil Robertson remained the one volatile element of the series that no high-powered producer could ever predict, let alone control. He absolutely refused to entertain scripted suggestions, and frankly, he had zero patience for the glossy, polished veneer of typical reality television. There is a legendary story that still circulates among the production staff regarding a specific dinner sequence where Phil was asked to deliver the standard grace before the meal. Instead of sticking to the script, he launched into a fiery, unscripted blessing that aggressively condemned the godless heathens from Los Angeles, leaving the entire crew completely stunned and bursting into nervous laughter. That moment was Phil in a nutshell, completely unfiltered, brutally sincere, and absolutely impossible to air on national television without creating a scandal. While these raw, unpolished incidents made the fans fall in love with him, They created a logistical nightmare for producers who were desperately trying to mould a coherent show while keeping its authenticity intact. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the pressure mounting on the actual family business was becoming suffocatingly heavy. The massive success of the series caused orders for Duck Commander products to skyrocket, leaping from a manageable 50,000 units to a mind-blowing 1.5 million duck calls in just a single year. The company's humble family-run operation was simply not designed to handle that kind of industrial-scale demand so suddenly. The holiday seasons became a battlefield, websites crashed under traffic phone lines were permanently jammed, and the staff made frantic attempts to track down orders that had been paid for but vanished into a system overload. Employees were grinding through brutal 24-hour shifts, bleary-eyed and desperate, while Willie spent countless sleepless nights trying to stop the entire operation from collapsing under its own weight. Yet, despite the absolute chaos unfolding behind the warehouse doors, the show continued to paint the family as relaxed, playful, and forever engaged in low-stakes, light-hearted hijinks. The viewers at home watched the Robertsons fishing in the middle of the workday, concocting elaborate pranks or inventing hilarious jury-rigged solutions to minor inconveniences. While those moments did happen and were genuine, they represented a tiny curated sliver of their actual daily existence. When the directors yelled cut, the family was physically exhausted, buried under a mountain of logistical crises and stretched so thin that their private lives became indistinguishable from their corporate obligations. This widening chasm between the public perception and their private reality created a simmering tension that only intensified with every passing season. Millions of fans were convinced the Robertsons were living the ultimate dream, an easygoing life filled with joy, mud, and laughter. In stark truth, they were fighting a daily war to keep up with a business that had spiralled out of control and a filming schedule that robbed them of rest and privacy. While this relentless strain didn't destroy the family unit entirely, it certainly planted the earliest dangerous seeds of severe burnout. These were the first warning signs that the dynasty the world had come to adore was already beginning to fracture beneath the crushing weight of its own fame. But when the cracks in the foundation start to appear, which values are the first to be tested? Stick around because it gets deeper. We are looking at the moment when their faith transformed into a cultural battlefield. You have to understand, faith was never just a clever branding tool or a marketing gimmick for the Robertson clan. It existed long before the cameras of Duck Dynasty ever arrived, shaping exactly how the family lived, how they did business, and how they treated one another. In the beginning, that raw authenticity was exactly what helped the show distinguish itself from the rest of reality TV. Viewers weren't watching polished, pre-approved sermons. They were witnessing a real family whose deep-seated beliefs were naturally woven into the fabric of their daily lives, especially during those iconic dinner prayers that became the show's signature. However, as the audience numbers swelled into the millions, that same faith quietly became a major source of friction behind closed doors. Phil Robertson later went on record alleging that the early episodes were deliberately edited to sanitize their religious expression, including the specific removal of phrases like "in Jesus' name" during the prayers. According to Phil's account, the producers were terrified that such overt Christian language might alienate the more secular segments of their massive national audience. To a man like Phil, those editorial cuts felt like blatant censorship, a clear signal that the show was demanding they water down the one thing the family considered absolutely non-negotiable. Of course, A&E strongly disputed that interpretation of events. The network maintained that Duck Dynasty was never designed to be a religious program and that their editorial choices were merely about balancing entertainment value with the broadest possible appeal. From the network's perspective, the faith element was still present and respected, but it had to be framed within a format digestible for millions of viewers holding vastly different worldviews. Both sides claimed they were acting with the best intentions, but this disagreement exposed a fundamental, unbridgeable divide between the talent and the executives. For the Robertsons, faith wasn't a volume knob you could turn down. It was an all-or-nothing proposition that had to be expressed honestly or not at all. For the network executives, clarity of messaging and maximising audience reach were the only metrics that truly mattered. This ideological gap placed Willie Robertson in an impossibly difficult position. As the executive producer, he had to fight tooth and nail to preserve his family's authentic voice. But as the primary bridge to A&E, he also carried the heavy burden of keeping the peace. Protecting the golden goose became a desperate struggle for survival. What started as the bedrock of their bond, their unwavering shared values gradually morphed into a massive crack in the foundation. Their religious devotion, once the secret source holding the clan together, suddenly transformed into the volatile ingredient most likely to spark a public relations nightmare, terrify the corporate sponsors, and completely derail the creative direction of the show. The cameras didn't erase the family's deep-seated convictions, but they relentlessly tested just how openly those beliefs could survive when placed under a microscopic global lens. So what actually goes down when a country boy's rigid worldview collides violently with the mainstream national spotlight? What happens when one voice screams a little too loud, "Don't go anywhere"? Let's talk about the magazine spread that nearly burned the house down. In December 2013, Duck Dynasty ceased to be just a quirky reality hit about duck hunters. A singular no-holds-barred interview that the patriarch Phil Robertson gave to GQ magazine turned the series into ground zero for a massive American cultural hurricane. It irrevocably altered the landscape, changing how the family, the television network, and the viewing public perceived the entire enterprise. During this fateful sit-down, Phil didn't hold back, speaking with brutal candour about his views on sin, the decay of morality, and his strict religious interpretations. His unfiltered commentary on homosexuality, marital infidelity, and racial history was pulled directly from his reading of the Bible. However, to a modern audience, his words landed as deeply offensive and incredibly inflammatory. The fallout wasn't just fast, it was instantaneous. Within hours, the internet was on fire. Advocacy groups were demanding heads roll. Headlines were screaming bloody murder, and the show became the new front line in America's bitter culture wars. The executives at A&E went into full panic mode. On December 18th, 2013, the network dropped the hammer, announcing that Phil was suspended indefinitely from filming. The decision sent shockwaves through the fan base and left the Robertson family completely blindsided. Millions of viewers revolted, accusing the network of silencing religious freedom, while the other half of the country applauded the suspension, insisting it was a necessary step toward accountability and social progress. The debate was visceral, immediate, and it split the nation right down the middle. Poor Willie Robertson was thrust into the ultimate executive nightmare overnight. He was stuck playing three-dimensional chess, trying to defend his father as a loyal son, while desperately attempting to salvage the family's multi-million-dollar brand, protect their employees, and ensure their physical safety. It was a no-win scenario. Staying silent looked like a tacit endorsement of the controversy, while mounting a strong defence risked scorching the earth and escalating the conflict further. Behind the closed doors of their Louisiana headquarters, Willie juggled intense media pressure, hostile negotiations with A&E suits, and private family arguments that were far more fractured than the happy image presented on TV. Those 9 long days of suspension peeled back the curtain on serious internal rifts. Some family members argued that Phil's right to preach the gospel should never be compromised for a paycheck. Others were terrified, watching the potential long-term destruction of their relationships, their business empire, and the public trust they had worked so hard to build. The pressure cooker of fame magnified every single difference, forcing them to have brutal, honest conversations that they never would have needed to have in the duck blind. Eventually, the network blinked. Facing a massive revolt from their audience, A&E reversed the decision, reinstating Phil without him missing a single scheduled episode. On paper, Duck Dynasty survived the axe, but the innocence was gone. From that moment on, the show carried a heavy dark cloud over the bayou. Every episode that aired was dissected by critics. Every offhand comment felt like walking through a minefield, and the carefree entertainment was replaced by a paranoid vigilance. The GQ disaster didn't kill the dynasty immediately, but it certainly left a scar that changed the DNA of the show forever. But even if the show managed to stay on air, what other skeletons were rattling in the closet, forced out by the glare of fame, you will want to stick around for this part. We are talking scandal, alleged abuse, infidelity, and national fury. At the absolute peak of their popularity, the Robertsons projected an image of bulletproof unity untouched by the chaos of celebrity. But Phil Robertson's explosive 2013 interview shattered that pristine illusion, plunging the family into one of the most turbulent and dangerous periods of their lives. Phil's blunt, uncompromising remarks regarding sin, sexuality and moral decay triggered immediate outrage and sparked a debate that raged across the country. As critics dug through his history with a fine-tooth comb, details of his past life, including an adulterous affair he had publicly admitted was part of his pre-born-again life, were dragged back into the spotlight. This resurfacing of old demons intensified the scrutiny, complicating his standing as the family's unshakable moral compass. The situation snowballed quickly beyond just a bad interview. Conservative supporters hoisted Phil up as a martyr, framing the backlash as a direct attack on their religious liberties and biblical convictions. Meanwhile, civil rights organisations and LGBTQ+ groups branded his comments as dangerous hate speech that caused real-world harm. The Robertsons became unwilling pawns in a political chess game they had never intended to play, symbolising a deep cultural divide. The show, which was once a source of light-hearted joy and humour, suddenly found itself serving as the battleground for a nasty national conflict. But the true tragedy was the emotional toll it took on the innocent. Willie and Corey Robertson's adopted son, Will, who is biracial, found himself in the crosshairs, becoming the target of vile racist attacks from strangers emboldened by the controversy. The cruelty struck a nerve, especially considering the couple had been warned during the adoption process that placing biracial children in the South was one of the most difficult challenges in the system. Their son's identity, once a beautiful testament to their family's love, was twisted into a weapon used against them in the public square, and then the backlash turned physically dangerous. As tensions reached a boiling point, the famous Robertson compound in Louisiana began receiving credible armed threats. For a family that prided itself on open doors and southern hospitality, turning their home into a fortress with security teams felt deeply unsettling and wrong. The nightmare scenario became real when an actual drive-by shooting targeted the property. A bullet tore through the window of the home where young John Luke, his wife and their infant child were sleeping. That shattered glass was the final wake-up call, transforming their private sanctuary into a site of fear and proving that the price of fame was their peace of mind. The unparalleled exposure brought with it perils that simply no one had foreseen. These incidents served as a definitive watershed moment for the clan. Yet despite the underlying tension, the Robertsons soldiered on with the filming schedule. However, that initial charm and effortless naivety of the earlier series had completely evaporated. Their newfound notoriety now dragged behind it a heavy chain of deep emotional scars and relationships stretched to their absolute breaking point, along with a perpetual nagging sense of impending peril. For Willie, this specific epoch unveiled a rather harrowing reality. It became clear that the programme's meteoric success had exacted a personal toll far steeper than any television ratings could ever hope to rationalise. So one must ask what actually transpires when the studio lights dim and the cameras cease rolling. Does that crushing pressure simply vanish into the ether, or does it stalk them into the shadows? Do stay tuned. This is Life Post-Duck Dynasty, a tale of reinvention and strategic retreat. When the curtains finally closed on Duck Dynasty in 2017, the general consensus was that Willie Robertson would simply fade into obscurity, vanishing entirely from the public gaze. Quite the contrary, he embarked upon a fresh chapter characterised by a calculated reinvention and a conscious pivot towards an existence that was decidedly quieter and significantly more substantive. One of the more jarring twists in the tale occurred in 2021 when Willie emerged as a competitor on the popular televised contest, The Masked Singer, donning the guise of the Mallard. His vivacious performances and surprisingly robust vocal capabilities left the viewing public flabbergasted, providing a rare peek at a creative flair that had remained entirely submerged during the family's rough and ready, outdoors-centric reality series. In truth, Willie had already ventured into the broader cultural zeitgeist long before this spectacle. Back in 2014, he and Corey featured in the Christian cinema piece God's Not Dead, a move perfectly in step with their dedication to faith-based media. Later that very same year, Willie was present at President Barack Obama's State of the Union address, a cameo that solidified just how profoundly the Robertsons had permeated the fabric of American popular culture. Yet another significant endeavour materialised in the form of At Home with the Robertsons, a digital series distributed online, wherein Willie and Corey welcome guests into their private residence to debate rather delicate subjects ranging from race and theology to the contentious issue of gun rights. The dialogue was refreshingly frank and grounded, signalling a marked departure from mere performance for entertainment's sake to a more thoughtful engagement with the genuine issues of the day. However, beneath the surface of these creative pursuits, Willie was quietly navigating a profound personal metamorphosis. Having spent decades constructing the Duck Commander brand, managing colossal merchandising empires and shouldering the heavy burden of national celebrity, he came to the stark realisation of just how much precious time he had squandered away from his burgeoning family. By the year 2025, boasting 7 grandchildren, Willie declared that he was now, in his own words, fully semi-retired, while the phrase became something of a light-hearted jest. Amongst the fan base for Willie himself, it signified a solemn pledge to decelerate the pace of his life. His desires had distilled into something quite simple: to be truly present. Following years defined by relentless expansion and the glare of public scrutiny, Willie opted for an existence anchored in family faith and the reclamation of lost time, embracing a more subdued legacy well beyond the intrusive reach of the camera lens. Now we turn to the final heartbreak, precisely why the dynasty could never be resurrected. For years, devotees clung to the hope that Duck Dynasty might somehow rise from the ashes in its original guise. But the cold, hard truth is that the programme had effectively concluded long before any official public decree was issued. Its spirit was quietly dissipating as the Robertson clan evolved, matured, and weathered heartbreaks that the cameras were simply unable to capture. The ultimate irreversible turning point arrived with the gradual decline of the patriarch Phil Robertson. The cruel encroachment of Alzheimer's slowly dimmed that larger-than-life figure who had served as the family's anchor, both in a spiritual and emotional sense. When Phil departed this life on the 25th of May 2025, any realistic prospect of a full-scale revival evaporated along with him. His imposing presence had been the very heartbeat of the dynasty. Without him, the world they had so carefully constructed could never be rebuilt. Concurrently, the younger generation had moved significantly beyond the artificial rhythms of television life. Reed, for instance, pursued a musical career in Nashville, whilst John Luke assumed a leadership role at Camp Chioka, dedicating his hours to mentorship and religious ministry. Sadie transformed herself into a best-selling author and an influential Christian orator, forging a career built upon authenticity rather than the fleeting fame of reality television. Bella, meanwhile, opted for privacy marriage and a decidedly quieter existence. The subsequent generation was certainly not waiting for the cameras to return. They were already busy inscribing new chapters of their own lives. Eventually, Willie confessed to a truth that most fans had never even contemplated. Duck Dynasty did not perish because the audience simply wandered off. It concluded because the family could no longer maintain the personae they once projected on camera. Life had irrevocably shifted. Priorities had fundamentally altered. That unity which had lent the show its power could simply not be recreated under the crushing weight of grief, personal growth, and the passage of time. And yet bringing the curtain down on the show was hardly a triumph for Willie. It was a profound heartbreak. He would later confess that walking away was more painful than remaining would have been. Duck Dynasty was not merely a hit series, it was a shared era of their lives, one that had shaped the family's very identity and created memories that could never be duplicated. A palpable grief followed the cancellation. There were no jubilant celebrations, no collective sighs of relief, only the quiet, sombre realisation that a cherished season had closed forever. However, Willie also came to comprehend a deeper truth, the distinction between longevity and legacy. Longevity merely asks how long a thing might last. Legacy, on the other hand, asks what it leaves behind. Attempting to stretch the show any further would have risked diluting its intrinsic meaning. Ending it served to preserve its impact. Most importantly, halting the production was an act of protection. It shielded the family from deeper exhaustion, from even greater scrutiny, and from the utter loss of control over their own narrative. It was ultimately a desperate bid to reclaim their own existence before it was too late. By walking away, they ensured that the next generation wouldn't be saddled with a glittering curse, a heavy burden that masqueraded as a golden opportunity, but was actually a trap. Pulling the plug on the Duck Dynasty phenomenon was never about waving a white flag of surrender. On the contrary, it was a profound act of duty and moral responsibility to protect the family unit from total disintegration. While the rumoured revival in the year 2025 might serve up a slice of comfort food for the nostalgic, Willie is shrewd enough to realise that the original spark has faded and that specific brand of magic is gone forever. The dynasty didn't crumble because of failure. It ended because the very people who constructed the empire finally found the courage to value their own souls and well-being over the relentless grinding demands of the media machine they birthed. But we have to ask, what is your perspective on the family's pivot? What do you think it really cost the Robertsons to choose a life of tranquility over the addiction of fame in the wake of Phil's passing? Let us know your insights. Be sure to drop your opinions in the comments section below, and remember to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all the latest scandals and deep dives we uncover.